He leaned in to kiss me, and what came off my lips was dust. Not warmth, not breath. Dust, the kind that lives in sealed places, in rooms no one has opened in 100 years. His hands went still against my face. I had spent months learning the smell of it. He had no name for what he was inhaling, no shelf in his mind where a thing like this could be filed away and managed. That's the part one had counted on. The decision to leave had been clean. One clear line drawn through everything. It was the years before the decision, the choosing and the choosing and the choosing, that had worn me down to this, a woman who found the only door left and walked through it alone. If you've ever made yourself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of you, this story is for you. Stay with me. And if these stories find you at the right moment, the way they seem to find the women who need them, there's a subscribe button below. No pressure. Just a quiet place to come back to. The Gardenias came on Thursdays. He never varied this. 7 years, and the Gardenias arrived every Thursday morning, cut from the conservatory below the east wing, stems wrapped in a square of white linen, set on the ledge beside my window chair without comment. He did not need to explain them. In his mind, the gesture was complete. The flowers arrived. I received them. The circuit closed. I used to move them to the writing table on the other side of the room, just to have something to do with my hands. I stopped doing that in the 3rd year. It was easier not to. The estate sat on a ridge above the Alabama River Valley, and in the mornings the city below was barely visible through the glass, a smear of amber and gray in the low winter light, Montgomery going about its life without me. The glass walls had seemed extraordinary when I first came here. All that visibility, all that light. I had stood in the main room on the first night, looking out at the valley and thought, a house like this has nothing to hide. I was 31 years old and coming off 18 months of physical therapy. I had survived a structural collapse that my 2 colleagues had not. My left hand still wouldn't fully close. I was not in a position to be discerning about metaphors. He came into the sitting room at 9:30, the way he always did. White suit, silver cufflinks, the slight, precise smile of a man who has arranged his morning exactly as he intended.
"You're still," he said.
Approving. I had been watching a hawk work the updrafts over the valley. It had dropped twice in the last 10 minutes, fast and low, vanishing below the ridge line, and risen again empty-handed. I tracked it without thinking. My body was turned toward the window, folded into the chair, hands loose in my lap. I realized, exactly as he preferred me to look. I was watching a hawk, I said. He followed my gaze with the mild interest of a man humoring a preference he doesn't share.
"Hunting," he noted.
Then, already moving toward the writing table, restless creatures. He said it the way he said most things about wildness. Gently dismissive. As though restlessness were a failure of imagination, a thing you outgrew, if you were paying attention. I turned back to the window. The hawk was gone. In the evenings, he brushed my hair. 100 strokes, always. He counted them under his breath. Not because he needed to, I think, but because the count was part of the ritual, and he was a man who understood the weight of ritual. He had been performing them for centuries before I was born. "You're learning it," he told me one night, working through a tangle at the ends with a patience that made my chest ache in a way I no longer had clean words for. The immortal pause. Most humans fight it for years. You've taken to it beautifully. I was looking at the frost building at the corner of the window glass, the way it crept inward from the edges, slow and certain, covering the view by degrees. "Thank you," I said. He set the brush down and rested his hands briefly on my shoulders. A touch of satisfaction, not tenderness. The way a craftsman might regard finished work. I kept my face very still. The locked cabinet was in the east wing, past the library, in a room he used for storing architectural records. I had told him, 2 years ago, that I kept old survey maps there, field drawings from properties I had assessed before I came to him, things I returned to occasionally out of professional habit. He had not questioned this. Sierra, the conservationist. Sierra, who understood the beauty of preserved things. It was part of why he had wanted me. He had no reason to look closer. I went to it that evening after he retired. The key was on a cord I wore beneath my dress, had worn there for 3 years, the metal warm from my skin. The lock opened without sound. Inside, a small glass vial, nearly empty. A folded document I did not open. A letter I had finished writing 6 weeks ago, and read only once since. I lifted the vial, held it to the thin light from the hallway.
2 grains.
Maybe 3. I set it back, closed the cabinet.
Turn the key.
My hands were perfectly steady. That was the thing about arriving at the end of a long decision. The shaking had already happened months ago, alone in this same room, before I had fully understood what I was choosing. By now the choosing was finished. What remained was only the carrying out of it. I walked back down the corridor toward the sitting room. Through the glass walls, Montgomery glowed below in the valley, the lights along Dexter Avenue, the river's dark bend to the south, the older neighborhoods where my mother had grown up on streets named for men she was never meant to equal. I pressed one hand flat to the glass. The cold moved through my palm. Steady, patient. Still, I thought, not yet, but almost. He came to find me the next morning with the drawings under his arm. I knew what they were before he unrolled them. He had been carrying a particular quality of anticipation for weeks, a brightness around the edges of his usual composure, the way a man looks when he has been keeping a gift and can no longer wait to give it. He set his coffee on the side table, moved the gardenia vase without looking at it, and knelt on the marble floor with the ease of someone whose knees have not ached in 3 centuries. "Come down here," he said. I set aside the book I had not been reading and lowered myself to the floor beside him. The drawings were extraordinary. That is the honest thing, and I am trying, in whatever time I have left for honesty, to say the honest thing. He unrolled them across the white marble, 4 large sheets, hand-rendered in the architectural drafting style he had learned before computers existed, before the profession had a name, and what I saw was the work of a man who had spent decades thinking about light. The mausoleum was not a tomb. That was the first thing. It was a house, a low, river-facing structure with long corridors and interior gardens, designed to hold the particular quality of morning light that came off the Alabama River in winter. He had calculated the angles. There were notes in the margins in his small, precise hand, east-facing glass, 6 a.m. equinox. Sierra's reading room faces the garden. A wing on the southern end, labeled simply, her things. He traced the main corridor with one finger, following it from entrance to garden as he spoke. The stone he had chosen. The way the water feature would sound from the bedroom. The specific variety of white rose he intended for the outer wall because he had read, somewhere, that I had once written about them in a field assessment, a throwaway line in a report about a Reconstruction-era property on the edge of downtown, and he had remembered it, had held it all this time like something valuable. He looked up. "What do you think?" The floor was cold through the thin fabric of my dress. The drawings smelled faintly of the drafting room. Old paper, iron gall ink, the particular dry warmth of a space that is kept always at the same temperature. "It's beautiful," I said. I meant it. That was the worst part. I looked at those drawings and I saw something genuinely beautiful, thought through and cared for, made with a specific knowledge of one woman's preferences accumulated over 7 years of careful watching. He had designed something exquisite for a woman who no longer existed. He smiled. Not his managed smile, the one he wore for guests and silences he wanted to control, but the other one, the rarer one, that made him look briefly like someone who had once been young and remembered it. He rolled the edge of the nearest drawing back with 2 fingers, smoothing a small wrinkle, and I thought, he is happy. Genuinely, completely happy, in the way that people are happy when a long effort has finally taken its right shape. I stayed very still. The first night I came here, he had lit every room. I don't know why that memory arrived while I was sitting on the marble floor with his blueprints spread between us, but it did, clear and complete, the way certain memories arrive when the body recognizes something the mind is still catching up to. He had driven me up the ridge road in a car that smelled of old leather and wood polish, and when we came through the door, the whole house was blazing. Every lamp, every overhead light. The conservatory below was lit from within, so the glass walls of the main room reflected it back, and the effect was, I remember thinking, like standing inside a lantern. He had found a record player. He had put on Nat King Cole. He was from Alabama, he had learned, and he had constructed from that single fact an entire theory of what she would love. Warm, unhurried, southern in its bones. He was swaying very slightly when I came through the door.
His back was to me.
He didn't hear me over the music. And I stood there watching this ancient, silver-haired man moving with total unself-conscious pleasure to a song he had chosen for me out of pure, earnest wrongness. I had never once cared for Nat King Cole, and I felt something open in my chest. Not love. Something more complicated than love. Recognition, maybe. The particular ache of watching someone try their absolute best with the wrong information, and finding it more moving than accuracy would have been. I had chosen this. I had walked up the ridge road of my own will, with my ruined hand and my grief that had nowhere left to go, and I had chosen him. That was true. It remained true. The memory doesn't change anything. It just makes the price legible. He fell asleep near midnight, the drawings re-rolled and stacked beside his chair, his empty glass on the side table. I watched his face go quiet. The composure he wore while awake was not so different from sleep, but there was something in sleep that let the centuries show, some loosening around his eyes that made him look less like a sovereign and more like a very old man who was tired. I left him there and went to the window. Montgomery below was doing what it always did at this hour, holding its lights against the dark, the river a black absence to the south, Dexter Avenue a thin gold line through the older part of the city. My mother's neighborhood was out there somewhere in the eastern dark, the red clay streets where she had walked to school and been told, in various ways, to be still. She had not been still. I pressed my palm to the glass. The cold came through immediately, deep and dry, the specific cold of mountain glass in February, the kind that doesn't negotiate.
3 grains.
I had counted them again before dinner, in the brief window when he was in the drafting room, and the house was mine for 6 unmonitored minutes. 3 grains in the vial. I had worked out the timing weeks ago, 2 days from the last grain to the full withdrawal. Maybe 3. I stood there with the cold moving through my hand and looked at the city where I was born, the river my mother had shown me when I was 4 years old, and said, "That water has been going somewhere longer than anyone can remember." Doesn't that make you feel better? It had then. I thought about the blueprint, the river-facing garden, the reading room with the east-facing glass. I thought. He drew it so carefully. The cold reached my wrist. I did not move my hand. Still I thought. Almost. 3 grains. I had been saying it to myself for 2 days like a number that needed to stay real. 3 grains. The vial in the locked cabinet, nearly weightless now, holding the last of what I had gathered in careful increments over the course of 3 years. I had always been precise in my work. That precision had not left me. What I want to say clearly, because clarity is the last courtesy I can offer, is that the lethe dust is not poison.
This matters to me.
I need it to matter to anyone who might one day try to understand. Poison damages. Poison is an act of destruction directed at the body, and the body registers it as violation. The dust does something else entirely. It severs the spirit's attachment to form, not violently, not with force, but the way you might untie a knot that has been holding 2 things together long enough that both things have forgotten what they were before they were bound. The body remains
Warm.
intact, breathing, for a time, the shallow breath of the deepest sleep. What leaves is the part that has been trying to leave for years, the part that has been pressing its hands against glass, watching the city lights below, thinking, there. I should be there. The eternal vow is a ritual of departure, not death. I have spent a long time sitting with that distinction, turning it in my hands, and I still believe it is a true one. I found the dust 3 years ago. Elias had arranged a supervised assessment, one of his rare concessions to the life I had lived before the ridge, before the glass walls and the curated silence. A Montgomery estate on the south edge of downtown, a pre-Civil War property that a development firm wanted assessed for structural integrity before demolition. He drove, me himself, waited in the car with his newspaper and his particular brand of patient sovereignty while I went in with my equipment. The basement level had a subfloor structure that predated the main building by at least a century. I had pushed up a section of old board and found myself looking down into a space that the estate's original builders had sealed and built over, a room, or what had been a room, now just dimensions and remnant objects and a fine gray sediment coating every surface like the inside of a clock that has not been opened in a very long time. I knew what it was before I touched it. 2 years earlier, working through Elias's restricted archive late on a night he believed I was sleeping, I had read the entry on Lethe dust in a hand-bound volume with no title on its spine. He kept those volumes on the highest shelf, which was not a lock, only a suggestion, the kind of boundary that assumed I lacked curiosity. I had read the entry twice. I had not thought about it as a practical matter then. I had filed it the way you file certain information. Not for use, but for knowing. Standing in that basement with gray sediment on my gloved fingertips, I did think about it practically. I stood there for a long time, long enough that my knees began to ache. Then I collected what I could in the small specimen vials I carried for fieldwork, labeled them in my professional shorthand, and put them in my bag. I walked back to the car. Elias looked up from his newspaper. "Anything of note?" he asked. "Subfloor anomalies," I said. "Not structurally significant." He nodded and folded his paper. We drove back up the ridge. Was it grief? Was it choice? I have turned that question over so many times that the edges are worn smooth. I cannot find a seam between them. Grief has a weight that changes the quality of every decision you make while carrying it, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way that a stone in a coat pocket changes the way you walk. You compensate. You hold your body differently. After a while you forget you're compensating. The stone feels like part of you. I do not know at this point which parts of me are Sierra and which parts are 7 years of compensation. She lets it sit. Montgomery smells like wisteria in March. Not up here. Up here the air is climate-controlled to a temperature Elias finds aesthetically appropriate, and it smells of marble and gardenia water and the faint iron undertone of old stone.
Clean. Exact.
Above the weather, above the particular democracy of seasons that means everyone in the valley below is smelling the same wet clay and green water and purple flower weight all at once, whether they want to or not. I have not smelled wisteria in 3 years. The iron fences on the older streets downtown used to hold it, great heavy curtains of it, blooming so hard in late March that you could taste the sweetness at the back of your throat 3 houses away. My mother used to stop and put her face directly into a cluster of blooms and breathe. A greedy, unashamed breath, the kind a woman takes when she has decided the world owes her at least this much. I think about that. Her face in the flowers. I think about the river in heavy rain, the way it turns red-brown with Alabama clay and smells like something very old moving very fast, like the earth is briefly being honest about what it's made of. I've been above all of that for 3 years. Above the weather, above the wisteria, above the river doing its honest thing in the valley below. The last morning came in the gray hour before dawn. The house was silent in the specific way it goes silent at that hour, not empty, but held. Elias asleep in the far wing, the conservatory below dark, the ridge outside carrying the particular stillness of winter air that has nowhere left to go. I sat in the window chair. The vial was open in my palm. 1 grain. I had counted wrong. There was only ever 1 grain left, not 3, and somewhere in the counting I had been managing myself, the way you say I'll leave in 5 minutes when you mean you cannot yet bring yourself to leave. I had been saying 3 for 2 days to give myself 2 more days. I sat with that for a moment, the particular tenderness of being caught in your own small mercy. Then I placed it on my tongue. It tasted like river water, like rain on limestone after a long dry spell, that specific taste of a surface finally receiving what it has been waiting for. Like something that has been underground long enough to forget urgency and release it and be the better for the letting go. The cold from the window glass moved against my cheek. Below me, Montgomery was still dark. I folded my hands in my lap. I closed my eyes. Still, I thought. On my own terms. Finally still. The first thing I noticed was the light. Not the light itself. The estate's light never changed, climate-controlled and consistent. The same pale winter quality at noon as at 4 in the afternoon. What changed was my relationship to it. It arrived at my eyes and registered correctly, but the signal traveled slower than it used to, the way sound travels across water, accurate, but with a small delay that reminds you of the distance. I was still in the chair. I knew this. I could feel the window at my back, the cold pressing through the glass in the particular way it had for 7 years, and I could see the conservatory below and the river valley beyond it, Montgomery going about its morning. I was present. I was just further back inside myself than I had been before, like watching through a window I had always been able to open, and finding it sealed now, and finding, to my own quiet surprise, that I did not mind. The dust was working. It would take days. I had read this, and it was true. What I had not fully anticipated was how clearly I would be able to observe him. Elias was happy. I want to say that plainly because it is the center of everything, the thing that requires the most careful looking at. In the days following that gray pre-dawn morning, as I sat in the window chair and the house moved around me, he was happy. Not relieved. Not cautiously optimistic. Happy in the specific way of a man who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has finally watched it arrive. He moved through the rooms with a lightness I had not seen in years. He hummed, occasionally low, tuneless, the sound a person makes when their interior state has nowhere else to go. He brought the gardenias on Thursday and placed them on the window ledge and looked at me for a long moment with the expression he reserved for things he considered correctly arranged. "There it is," he said softly.
Not to me, exactly.
To the room, to the situation, to some private satisfaction that had finally been confirmed. He meant my stillness. He had been waiting, all these years, for me to stop resisting the shape he had in mind for me. He had been patient, genuinely, extraordinarily patient, in the way that only a man with centuries to spend can be patient. And now the waiting was over, and the result was everything he had hoped for, and he was grateful for it in the way you are grateful when a long effort is finally, completely done. I watched him go back to his drafting table and pick up his pen. I thought, he does not know. He may never know. The thought arrived without weight. I had already spent the weight of it, months ago, in that basement room with gray sediment on my gloves. The brushing continued. Every evening 100 strokes, the same as always, except that now he spoke more freely while he did it, the way people speak in rooms they believe are empty of anything that might push back. He told me about the progress on the blueprints. The stone supplier in Birmingham who had found a match for the corridor marble. The rose variety he had ordered for the outer garden wall. He was building the mausoleum in real time, planning and revising and making the 1,000 small decisions that a large project requires, and he narrated it to me the way you narrate to something you love, not needing a response, needing only a witness. I was a very good witness. That was the cruelest irony I had left. I was, in those days, more present to his daily life than I had been in years. I could not be elsewhere. I could not be distracted or resistant or quietly managing my own interior weather while he spoke. I simply watched and heard and received all of it, every detail of the life he was building for us in stone and white marble and river-facing glass. This is what I was always going to become for him. The thought came up slow, like something surfacing from deep water. The only question was whether I would be present inside the stillness or gone from it. I chose to be gone. He hasn't noticed the difference. He may never notice the difference.
I sat with that for a long time.
That is not a tragedy. It is a confession. On the fourth evening or the fifth, I had lost the clean edge between days. He paused mid-stroke. It was not dramatic. He did not startle. He simply stopped, the brush held loosely in his hand, and went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was occupied, a man thinking, planning, moving pieces in his mind. This quiet was attentive. Something had reached him that he did not yet have a category for. He set the brush on the side table. He leaned forward and looked at my face. The room held its breath. The conservatory below was dark. The only sound was the faint pressure of winter wind against the glass walls, that low, continuous note the house made when the weather moved through the valley.
He looked at me for a long time.
I could feel his attention the way you feel a change in air pressure, not touching me, but present against my skin, searching for something he could not name. He was close enough that I could smell his coat, cedar and old paper and the particular cold that lived in him always, deeper than fabric, deeper than skin. Something in him was almost there. Almost, I thought. Look closer. Look at what you actually see. He smiled. It was the warm smile. The rare one. The one that made him look like someone who had once been young and still visited that feeling occasionally. There she is, he murmured. His voice was low, satisfied. The voice of a man who has just confirmed something he always knew. There's my still life. He picked up the brush, resumed the count from where he had left off. 84. 85. I watched the valley below. The river was invisible in the dark, but I knew where it was. I had always known where it was. You learn the shape of the thing you cannot reach. He did not look at my face again that evening. 86. 87. He went back to his blueprints when he was done, and I heard him humming again, that low, tuneless sound of a man whose interior life has finally settled into the arrangement he always wanted. The pen scratched across the drafting paper. The lamp on his table made a warm circle in the dark room. He was building us a home. I was already gone. The two things were both true, and he would not understand how until he leaned in to kiss me and found, instead of warmth, instead of breath, instead of the woman he had so carefully, so lovingly arranged, only dust. Old as ruin, cold as the space between everything. He finished the drawings that evening. I knew it before he told me. There was a quality to the silence from the drafting room, a completed silence, the kind that fills a space after a long, sustained effort finally releases. I had known that silence from my own work, the moment you set down your pen and look at what you have made, and the air in the room is different, heavier with the weight of the finished thing. He came to find me with his glass already poured. Something dark. He held it loosely, the way he held things he was not thinking about, and he was not thinking about the glass because he was thinking about the blueprints, still inside them, still moving through the corridors he had drawn, already inhabiting the space that existed only on paper. His face had the open, unguarded quality that finished work produces in people who have loved what they were doing. He was, in that moment, genuinely beautiful. I want to say that too. Before this ends, I want to say that. He stood by my window chair and talked about the garden, the river-facing wall, and how the morning light would arrive there in winter, low and gold, hitting the white roses at an angle that would make them glow from within rather than simply reflect. He had thought about this. He had calculated it the way I used to calculate load-bearing ratios and stress points, with a specific care of someone who understands that the difference between a structure that endures and one that fails is almost always a matter of the details no one else thought worth measuring. The main corridor, he said, turning his glass slowly, will use the same marble as this room. Blue-gray veining in white. Do you see how the light moves across that wall at noon? He gestured at the far wall of the sitting room, where the winter light was doing exactly what he described, traveling across the stone in a slow diagonal, picking out the gray threads in the white. Consistency, he said. That is the highest form of love, Sierra. Do you understand? To make every room feel like the room she already knows. To build her a world where nothing is strange. He looked at me then. The window glass was cold at my back. The valley below had gone dark early, the way it does in February, and the lights of Montgomery were already up, that amber scatter along the river bend, the grid of the older neighborhoods, the thin gold line of Dexter Avenue running south. He set his glass on the side table. He leaned forward. His hands were cold against my face. They had always been cold, a deep cold that lived in the bone, not the skin, the cold of a man whose blood had stopped making its own heat long before I was born. I had loved that cold in the beginning. It had felt like relief, like pressing your wrists against something marble and still on a hot Alabama night. I had turned my face into it more than once and simply stayed there, grateful for the temperature of him. He kissed me. What came off my lips was dust. He felt it before he understood it. A fractional pause in the kiss, his body registering something before his mind could classify it. Then he pulled back. The dust rose between us and the lamplight. Barely visible. A faint gray dispersal, the kind of thing you would miss if you were not already watching for it, already braced for what it meant. It smelled like the inside of a room that has been sealed for a century. Chalk and river sediment, and something older than either. Something that had been underground long enough to lose the memory of what above ground smelled like. He went very still. For the first time in this story, in all the years of this story, he was the one who was still. I watched him from wherever I was by then, that reseated interior place, that room inside a room. I watched him hold the stillness the way a man holds something fragile that is just cracked, not yet broken, still possible to know. Not possible. He did not know that yet. He pulled back further. He looked at my face. My face was what it had been for days. Composed, pale, resting. The face of a woman in the deepest sleep. He had seen it every evening and called it beautiful, called it ripened, called it the perfection he had always been working toward. He looked at it now and saw something different. He looked at my hands, folded in my lap, the way they had been folded for days, the left one with its old injury still faintly visible in the way the tendon sat, the small crookedness that 7 years of supervised physical stillness had never fully straightened. He looked at my eyes closed. Not in sleep. He knew the quality of my sleep, had observed it for 7 years, had sat in the chair across from me on nights when I drifted off by the window, had noted the particular softness of a face in genuine rest. He had a precise vocabulary for my unconscious states, the way collectors develop precise vocabularies for the things they study most closely. What he was looking at now was not in that vocabulary. Something finished. Something that had arrived at its final form and would not be revised. He made a sound. It was not a word. It arrived from somewhere below language, low, and wrong in the specific way that a note played on a damaged instrument is wrong. Technically recognizable, but carrying a quality that makes the listener's body respond before the mind does. The sound a man makes when the architecture he has spent decades building turns out to have been constructed over something that was never there.
He reached for my hand.
It was warm. That is the mercy of the vow and the cruelty of it. The body remains. Temperature intact. The faint rise and fall of breath, slow as a tide going out very gradually, still present. He could hold my hand and feel warmth in it, could press his thumb against the inside of my wrist and find, not the pulse of a living woman, but close enough to be mistaken, close enough to make a man who loves you want to believe he is mistaken. He held my hand in both of his. The sound he had made did not come again. What replaced it was a silence of a completely different quality from any silence I had heard him produce. Not controlled, not curated, not the sovereign quiet of a man who chooses when to speak. This was the silence of a man who had lost the mechanism. I wanted to tell him, I knew you loved me. That was never the question. I wanted to tell him, the question was whether you knew me. And the answer, Elias, the answer was that you loved something with my face, and called it by my name, and built it a house for 1,000 years, and I could not live inside it. I could not tell him anything. I was already somewhere else, further back, receding, the way the shore recedes when you are finally moving with the current rather than against it. His hands were cold around mine. My hands were warm. The river was down there in the dark valley, going south. That water, my mother had said once, has been going somewhere longer than anyone can remember. I thought, yes. Me too. Me too. I am telling this from somewhere I do not have precise words for. Not far. That is the first thing I want to say, not the vast cold distance you might imagine, not the absence of everything familiar. More like the quality of a room you have just left, when you can still feel the warmth of it on your skin and smell the particular air of it in your hair, and you know you are not in it anymore, and you also know, with a certainty that has no grief attached to it, that you are not going back. That is where I am. From here, I can still see the estate. Not visually, not the way you see a thing when you are standing in front of it, but in the way you carry a place after years of living inside it. The way a building lives in the body of someone who has spent enough time within its walls to know exactly which floorboard creaks and which window latch sticks, and where the light falls at 4 in the afternoon in February. I know where everything is. He found the page 3 days after the kiss. He had been moving through the house in a way I recognized, the particular movement of a man who cannot be still but has nowhere specific to go, who keeps returning to the same rooms, the same objects, as though one of them might yield something different on the 15th visit than it did on the 14th. He had gone to the window chair many times. He had stood beside it. He had not sat in it. On the 3rd day he did sit in it. He sat in it for a long time, in the gray afternoon light, with his hands on his knees and his face turned toward the valley below, Montgomery going about itself, indifferent and continuous, the river dark between its banks. He sat the way I used to sit, still, watching the middle distance for something that would not announce itself. After a while he shifted, the way you shift when you have been sitting on something uncomfortable and your body finally insists on naming it. He reached beneath the cushion. I had written it 6 weeks before the last morning, at the writing table in the East Wing, during one of the 3-hour windows when Elias was in the city, and the house was mine to move through without accounting for my movements. I had used my best drafting pencil, the one with the weight I preferred, the one I had brought with me from my old life and kept sharpened out of habit long after I had stopped doing fieldwork. It was not a long document. A single page, drawn and annotated in the clear, economic hand I had developed over 15 years of professional assessments, the hand that meant, these are facts, not feelings, and they are precise. It was a doorway. Dimensioned correctly. Proportioned for a standard residential threshold, with the specific modifications that allow a door to swing fully open without catching, the clearances, the hinge placement, the depth of the frame. Functional. Buildable. The kind of drawing a competent contractor could take to a lumber yard. In the lower margin, in lettering smaller than the rest, I had written, designed for a woman who needed to find one. That was all. Not, I am sorry. Not, you should have known. Not, here is what you did, laid out in evidence so that you may understand the verdict. He had spent decades drawing spaces for me to inhabit. I drew him one exit. What he did with it, I do not know. I want to be honest about that uncertainty. It would be a cleaner story if I could tell you he wept over it, or that he built it, or that he burned it in the conservatory fireplace with the specific fury of a man who cannot bear to be instructed. Any of those would be a satisfying ending, the kind that lets the listener close the story with both hands and set it down with a sense of completion.
I don't have that for you.
What I have is what I hoped. I hoped he would look at those dimensions for a long time. I hoped he would recognize the hand. He knew my drafting hand, had seen it in the fieldwork reports I kept in the East Wing cabinet, and he was not a man who missed details when he was paying attention. I hoped the recognition would arrive slowly, the way certain realizations arrive, not as a flash but as a tide, coming in degrees, each wave depositing a little more of the truth until the beach is covered, and you cannot remember what the dry sand looked like. I hoped he might understand, eventually, that a woman who is truly still has already left. The stillness is just what she leaves behind. Montgomery keeps its secrets in its foundations, in its sealed rooms, in the structures that get built over rather than torn down. I was not the first woman to go still in a house on the ridge above the valley. There are others in this city who carry things they did not ask to know. You can recognize them by the way they go quiet in a room, not from habit, not from fear, but from the specific practice of women who have made hard calculations and arrived at their own answers.
We do not talk about it.
We recognize each other. The wisteria will be coming in. It comes every March, climbing the iron fences on the older streets downtown, and the smell of it reaches the valley in heavy enough air, sweet and insistent, the smell of something growing whether or not it was invited to, blooming hard against the iron as though the iron were simply an opportunity rather than a constraint. I smelled it on the last morning.
Faint.
Through the sealed glass, through the climate-controlled air, through everything the estate had constructed to hold the outside world at the correct distance, a thread of it reached me. Or I reached it. I am not sure from where I am now which direction the reaching goes. I held it for a moment. That particular sweetness. That particular insistence. I thought, that's enough. I thought, that is enough to go with. If this story found you tonight, if something in the telling of it sat with you in a way you didn't expect, if Sierra's voice felt like a room you had been in before, there are others. Women who come to these stories not for distraction, but for the particular relief of being recognized. They're here. Subscribe and you won't lose your way back to them.